He is an anti-war activist, Iraq War veteran, a producer at the Empire Files, which I can speak for David. We endorse wholeheartedly. Mike Prysner. Mike, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yo, thanks for having me, guys. Happy to be on.
All right, and I'm just gonna let's see if we can get your mic a little bit louder.
Yeah, sure. I don't want to take up the
Let's see,
lead.
a little bit quiet. Yeah.
Is that cool? I can turn my gain up.
Yeah, let's get some more
How's that?
gain if we can. Oh, there we go.
It's a lot better.
that's
Perfect.
Sweet.
All right. Yeah, so Mike, I saw this tweet that you posted in the context of somebody dunking on Tim Pool and Vaush over some sanctions stuff, and I think this is a really, I found it really instructive and interesting uh, way to think about this thing. So I wanted you to flesh this out for us. But you said this isn't just an online thing. In the Gulf War, the anti-war movement split between the anti-imperialist wing and a much larger liberal wing, which actually had mass marches under the slogan "Sanctions, not war." U.S. sanctions then killed about a multiple Iraqis, mostly babies. Now, in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, like I want your understanding of that to the best. This is at Wednesday evening, February 9th. Things change. The most recent headlines I saw was, Macron and Putin had talks, and Macron said, we want to lower the temperature on this stuff. But any more up-to-date understanding you have on that? But also tell us about this ideological split in the anti-war movement and why it's significant.
Yeah, well, I guess first, just the Russia situation. I mean, like many potential conflicts, this is one of those where if right now the U.S. just did nothing at all, nothing would happen. Russia is not planning to invade Ukraine. Russia's been pretty clear about this. Their troop movements are pretty clear about it. And in particular, the Ukrainian government has been very clear about it. Specifically, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which is saying this is not happening. Why is everyone talking about this in the U.S.? And it's been pretty funny to see all the U.S. bourgeois media, the New York Times and others, having to run around and write all these op-eds to be like, no, actually, Ukraine is wrong and we are right, that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. So Ukraine probably worried about them being the flashpoint for World War III. So they're very much trying to turn down the temperature as well. And, this is really a long pattern. I mean, of course, the Cold War was a period where very much people thought that there was a chance of nuclear war and mutually assured destruction and bombs hitting American cities with nuclear warheads and bombs hitting Moscow with nuclear warheads. It was a very scary time for people. And so out of that came an actual framework or architecture to resolve things diplomatically, to turn down temperature, to make sure that there wasn't an outbreak of nuclear war. And there was multiple treaties and guarantees that both Russia and the United States came together. One of those guarantees was the United States on multiple occasions promising NATO will not expand east. And now NATO has expanded pretty much all the way up to Russia, except for Ukraine. Notably, that being actually a common route since the times of Napoleon for invasions into Russia. Most notably, the Nazi invasion into the Soviet Union, which killed 27 million Soviets, 15 million of whom were Russian. And so like any country, you have some kind of security concerns and some kinds of red lines about national defense and what you will and will not allow. But back to those treaties, all of those treaties that were set up as frameworks to make sure that things would not escalate to the way that they did during the Cold War, all of these treaties, the United States left them, all of them. And so all of these things that were put in place that would guarantee that we wouldn't get to a place where World War III could start and it could be nuclear. The most significant one recently was in 2019. Trump tore up this intermediate range missile treaty. And the reason that plays into the situation in Ukraine, which the U.S. media, of course, will never say, is now that treaty is gone. And of course, the U.S. effort to bring Ukraine into NATO, which is just the U.S.-controlled alliance of junior imperialist partners to the U.S. war machine. That would mean that now that treaty is gone, which is the very first step to the U.S. putting missiles in Ukraine that have a 2-minute flight time to Moscow with nuclear warheads. And so I think that if any country put missiles with a 2-minute flight time to Washington, D.C. on the Canadian border, there would be some kind of escalated tensions there. But I think that the important thing is that this is completely a crisis of the U.S. is making. If Russia is not going to invade Ukraine, and that's the end of it. But I think that people should remain vigilant because wars don't always start because leaders decide to start them. Wars, in particular, World War One, they start just as like a series of escalating tensions, and they almost can start accidentally. So all of these things that Biden is doing, sending more troops to Europe, doing expanding B-52, which drops nuclear weapons, expanding flight areas of B-52 bombers, scrambling jets to Russian aircrafts, doing aggressive naval operations. I mean, these are all things that could accidentally start a war just because of the US's own belligerence. And a war with Russia should concern people because the United States and Russia are the two biggest nuclear armed powers in the world. And so it's not a war that we want the reckless politicians in the United States starting just because, I don't know why they kind of created this crisis, maybe to, I don't know if you have thoughts on it, but maybe to distract a little bit from how bad Biden is doing and his, so they needed something there. But I guess back to this issue of sanctions, I mean, as we've seen this war escalation and the real absurdity of thinking about, going to war with Russia, even if they sent troops into Ukraine, which is, on their border, you've heard this renewed call for, you don't have to go to war. You can use sanctions to punish a country instead. And that was the reference to my tweet because I think it was being shared in the context of people like Tim Pool, and I think it came from a Vouch stream saying that we can just sanction. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we can sanction the hell out of them, like we don't have to go to war with them. That's not like a new idea. I mean, and so the history of the anti-war movement against the Gulf War is there was a huge upsurge against the 1990 and 91 war against Iraq. The U.S. hadn't really seen a big war in a very long time, really since Vietnam, where it was defeated. And so there was even in the military. I mean, there was thousands of deserters and conscientious objectors when the Gulf War started. People were just like, "I'm out of here," and even a couple mutinies, which are pretty interesting that we don't have time for. But the anti-war movement was huge. It was surging. It was in the streets, and there was this liberal wing that came into the leadership. That adopted this slogan, sanctions, not war. And it was so pervasive that I was at like 6 years old at the time. I remember writing a letter to President George H.W. Bush saying, don't go to war with Iraq. You can just stop sending them food instead. Because my mom, who was interested in the anti-war movement, that was the anti-war literature that reached her. It's like, they weren't showing it on TV. There was no internet. But she was reached by liberal forces in the anti-war movement saying, this is the demand. We need everyone to write to the president and say, withhold food and medicine from Iraq instead of going to war. And this was considered the liberal peace position. But it actually caused a split in the movement where there were separate marches, where there was marches literally under the banner, sanctions, not war. And there was opposing demonstrations led by communists that said no war in Iraq, which is a much better slogan. And I think that, of course, people, when they think of sanctions, they think of like, we're sanctioning Putin and like he can't like fly where he wants to fly or something like that. But sanctions by U.S. design are meant to hurt people. I mean, the whole strategy of sanctions, the entire reason that the U.S. sanctions any country, and we have a lot of examples, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, the entire point, North Korea, the entire point is to make life so difficult for regular people that they just put so much political pressure on the government that's the political leverage that the U.S. have. And so by design, they hurt innocent people, civilians, in particular, the most vulnerable people, older people, babies, and things like that. And so, it's unfortunate with the Russia thing that we see the regurgitation of very old debunked ideas. I mean, in the case of Iraq, as the tweet said, the results of the U.S. sanctions were genocidal, and there's really no other way to put it. And that would be the same case in Russia and everywhere else that it does them.
And I want to get back to talking a little bit more about the Ukraine-Russia stuff with you, because I'm really interested in your perspective there, because it has been sort of fascinating to watch, like the way that is being, like the headlines around it versus the actual facts on the ground. But I just wanted to add to the sanctions bit, it's honestly, one of the most, and it's horrible because it's murderous and genocidal, but like one of the most kind of liberal things, like, well, we wrote these sanctions to be very specific, to touch this and that, right? And oftentimes one was presented is not actually what's on the books, and two, you're basically saying we are creating a legal apparatus as one of the most powerful countries in the world, the economic powerhouse of the world, that if you want to do business with the United States government without having us harass you or come at you, you can't break any of these kind of rules. So what ends up happening from companies or organizations that do trade or business with in Iran or potentially Russia, is they say, oh, we're not going to do business there because we don't want to end up on the wrong side of the American sanctions. Right. I mean, this is something that happens in Iran right now when they're saying like, oh, well, these things don't prevent, certain kinds of medical equipment and things like that. Well, what ends up happening is people just walk away from the table because they don't want to do business with Iran and face punishment from the American government.
Yeah, no, it asphyxiates the economy. I mean, it blocks essential things, medicine, food, and like I've seen firsthand like the effects of what these sanctions do, in particular in Venezuela. I mean, completely crushed by sanctions. And if it wasn't for the kind of extremely heightened and mass political consciousness of working class people in that country, that the sanctions would have been successful. It's the same thing for Cuba. It's the same thing for Iran and Korea. It's like the sanctions are extremely effective and work unless you have developed a very strong and robust and active politically conscious population. And so really like like governments that don't involve the people, I can't really survive the impact of sanctions because they're going to become the target. And so that's the only reason countries have been able to survive against all odds, and barely surviving, and a lot of people not surviving. But I think that another thing for people to understand about the situation with Russia and Ukraine is that like this is the U.S. doctrine is to escalate war with Russia and with China. Ever since the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which collapsed itself. I mean, Russia was the first country in the Soviet Union to leave the Soviet Union, and then the rest of it, of course, collapsed. But ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States said we can never allow a power as big as the Soviet Union ever again. We can never allow a competitor like that ever again. And actually, in the U.S. National Defense Strategy Doctrine, which anyone can read, it says, I actually can quote it, principal priority is to counter Russia and China as competitors. And the way to do that is sustained investment in lethal force. And so when we hear the U.S., and in fact, the Pentagon specifically, say we need to make sure that Russia and China are countered as competitors, they're talking about economic competitors. I mean, they're not talking about Russia is going to attack us unless we develop our military. China is never going to attack the U.S. Russia is never going to attack the U.S. That's the kind of thing that generals in the Pentagon dream of doing, but no other country seriously wants to just start a random war with a big, powerful country and cause a disaster. The U.S. has proven that that's a pretty bad path to take to develop your country. And so the U.S. has in its doctrine to prevent Russia and China from being real economic competitors. So this is about hegemony of U.S. capitalism, of U.S. banks, of U.S. businesses. And how do they want to counter the economic competition of Russia and China? Well, they say it plainly. The development of lethal force, meaning continually investing and growing your capability to kill a lot of people, and to say, okay, our leverage to make sure that our businesses, our banks, our dollars are going to be going in places instead of China, instead of Russia. The contracts are going to be going to our companies instead of Russian Chinese companies. The leverage we have is to make killing machines that we can say, well, we'll just kill a lot of your people if you don't, allow us access to this area. And that is just the encapsulation of U.S. policy towards every country, everywhere in the world. It's just really nakedly about securing access to markets, resources, cash for U.S. businessmen, and then using the military and the weaponry of the military-industrial complex as its, tool with which to do that. I don't think most people would agree with doing that. If American workers knew that that's actually how U.S. foreign policy runs, you would say, that's a bad use of our, majority of our tax dollars.
And I mean, the irony, I guess irony is the wrong word. The cruelty of it is that like the empire is never like satisfied, right? Because so the ideological enemy in the Soviet Union is like destroyed, and then the American
Mhm.
government has essentially a foreign policy of trying to rub their nose and shit. Afterwards, we prevent and we prevent democracy from being able to spring up in that country. We interfere in elections. We always talk about everyone always talks about Trump and Putin, but like the United States actively interfered in elections in Russia in a way, and while propping up, oligarchs and mass privatization in the country. And I'm sorry, like if you are anti-Putin, for example, right? If you're an American, liberal who's very worked about Putin, I will tell you, the number one goal you should have for Russia is. When it comes to American policy toward Russia, is for the United States to get as far away as possible, because Putin only is able to exist in the kind of anti-democratic front that the American government has been, a big part of. And on top of that, I wanted to say about what I was saying about the empire never being satisfied. One of the things that is so terrible about the current situation is that, you know, Putin is certainly sitting on top of the state, and he has, people who are extremely wealthy and own a lot of the resources in that country. And what happens with the benefits from those resources? They go to the American and the United Kingdom financial markets and the real estate market. What I'm saying is like there's already a funnel of resources out of that part of the world into the West. And it just is like, if you ever think that you're going to be able to placate empire, just look at how the Americans and the United Kingdom have dealt with Russia post-Soviet Union.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great point too, because like it's easy to see with China, like why like the capitalist United States, we have to confront China because it's run by communists and they are
Mhm.
operating a foreign policy with a communist ideology and cooperation, all of these things, and it's this like it was in the after World War II, where you had the socialist camp and the capitalist camp, and the world divided into these two poles in the world, and you were with the communists or you were at the capitalist imperialist countries. So, of course, that explains, in addition to being a big economic competitor, U.S. hostility towards China. But Russia, after the Soviet Union was overthrown, the U.S., as you mentioned, was very involved in Yeltsin and the presidency and stuff like that. But Russia is a capitalist country now, and
Mhm.
kind of a pro-U.S. capitalist country. Like culturally, like Russian culture, like idealizes the U.S., wants to be like the U.S. I mean, there's no like hatred of America like you might find in other countries. So it would seem like, well, why doesn't the U.S. just want to ally with Russia? It's a big capitalist country that is probably willing to work with the United States. The reason for that, it just gets back to this issue of U.S. hegemony. So if why wouldn't Russia just become part of NATO then after the overthrow of the Soviet Union? The U.S. wants to gobble up all those other former Soviet republics and make them part of NATO, but why not Russia? And the reason is because the U.S. has to be the leader of NATO. If the U.S. let Russia into NATO, which would, stop any chance of a war between NATO and Russia, obviously, that would mean that Russia, a big, powerful, and country with a really deep history, would probably have a lot of influence in NATO. Other
Mhm.
European countries in NATO might, align more with Russia. Countries like Germany, especially, which has long-standing historical and cultural relationships with Russia, would probably gravitate more towards Russia as a NATO country. And so it's not just about like the ideological battle of socialism versus capitalism. It's about the U.S. We want capitalist countries in our orbit, but we have to be the most powerful capitalist country. And if there's another capitalist country that might step on our toes a little bit, and us as the great eagle at the top, and all of the other imperialist partners are under our wing, we can't accept that. So it exposes that the U.S. is just about its own domination, or its domination of its ruling class.
And I think that that's a really important point, in the sense that, like, one thing that I mean, this is just me being having some self reflection. I've been a little sad seeing even some of like the kind of like left slash socialist reaction to the crisis, right? And I don't know, just I think the vast majority of people who are principled socialists on this, I think, have had the right take. But I have seen, this kind of like, sanctions or, pro-sanction movements, or people saying, well, this time is different, right? This is like Putin is like the real threat to democracy. And I guess for me, as a member of the left, that has made me sad. But I want to make the larger point. That what you're seeing, I've just been trying to remind people, it's like, this is one of the good American socialist traditions, like World War One, as it was like the great communist tradition, right? Was opposing the imperialist war. And remember that there will always be a story, right? It's the Kaiser, right? Like there's always like some kind of threat that can be, sort of pumped out through the media. And I think when you look at Ukraine and Russia, I think one of the best examples of this is, one, to look at other countries' media, and two, look at the way that it's been sort of talked about in American press, in the sense that, like, this is a ticking time bomb. There's been some mobilization by Russia on the border, right? But nowhere near the kind of logistical capacity for any kind of like land invasion, right? So when people are sitting here, like, there's a picture that's being presented to the American public, right? That there are guys standing there and they're putting the barbed wire on the border and they're ready to charge over it. Like, there is no real logistical capacity for doing any of that. And once you start to see that, like, oh, well, this is being hyped up, then you really need to start challenging and questioning this narrative as to why, this story is sort of being promoted to all of us, that we are, 5 minutes to midnight of a full-on Russian land invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, and what you mentioned about how the people are just so inundated with this fear about Putin, and like it makes sense if you meet people who are like, yeah, I hate that guy, we should do something about him. I mean, this was back to that example of the Gulf War. I mean, this played out in a big way in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, also, where it was any anti-war voice that got on the mainstream media, because there were mass anti-war protests at the time. The first question that they would be asked would be, well, what do you think about Saddam Hussein? Don't you agree that he's a madman? Don't you agree that he's evil? And if you agree with that, then what do you think something has to be done about him? So if you're not for war, what are you for? What do you think should be done about him? And this again cleaved the anti-war struggle into a liberal and anti-imperialist wings. I mean, anti-imperialist leaders who would go on the news would say, I'm not answering that question. You're trying to trap me into a question to legitimize the war propaganda. Whereas the liberal wing would say, yes, of course, this is horrible. Something's got to be done, but war is not the answer, type of thing. And there was a split in the anti-war movement in 2003 also, and a pretty major one. And of course, the bigger wing, although both wings were pretty massive, bigger wing was led by Democrats, liberal organizations, and so forth. And that split was over slightly different things, but it came down to that kind of core. That core idea. And so it's a tried and true tactics. That's why the U.S. keeps using them, the boogeyman and everything. But I think maybe something that more be relatable to people is, do you really want Biden making decisions on whether or not we're going to go into World War III and then being in charge of World War III? It would seem. I think most people would think that's a bad move, no matter who's on the other side.